Hello and welcome to Davenant Hall Faculty Spotlight. I'm Nathan Johnson, the Provost of Davenant Hall, and joining me today is Joe Minich, a teaching fellow at the Davenant Institute and a professor at Davenant Hall. Dr. Joe Minich, welcome to Davenant Hall Faculty Spotlight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Where are you right now? Tell people what the beautiful site that's behind you.
Yeah, this is the this little spot here is the front porch of Davenant House, which has been our kind of OG little mecca site for all the Davenant fun that we've been having for 10 or so years now. This is the site in this room over here where we've done all of our national convivia. This porch is a sacred space to a lot of students who have vibed herein. Talked about the good, the true, and the beautiful for many hours late at night, men and women. Yeah, so this is kind of where it all happens in a local, organic way.
So tell us a little bit more about who you are and what your position at the Davenant Institute is.
So I'm Joseph Minich. I'm a residential fellow, I think, is the title we've come up for me, as I am here at Davenant House now performing some kind of residential ministry, in addition to being a kind of regular teaching fellow, full-time teaching fellow for Davenant Hall. So I do that, and then of course on the side I sort of do Davenant fellowship or Davenant teaching fellow stuff for Davenant Hall. But then you have a podcast side. I write a blog and do some podcasting for Davenant, the Pilgrim Faith podcast and the Plausible Faith podcast, do some writing. So that's kind of one piece of the hat. That this residential fellowship, which is why I'm on this porch here, is probably the new piece of my pie, which is taking all of that and then wanting to extend it to do some local organic ministries in the area and also kind of expand out, the other profile of sets of activities I do.
Many hats.
Yes, sir.
Yes. All worn very beautifully.
You know this very well.
So tell us how you got here. Give us a little bit of like an intellectual autobiography.
So I was raised in I was born, I should say, in California, but raised in Texas. In a pretty low church Eva context, think Calvary Chapel, maybe some kind of Bible Brethren church style stuff, and had a lot of good and formative experiences in that. Good. My parents were separated when I was very young, but my mother remarried a godly blue collar gentleman, is an auto mechanic who's also intellectually curious, and so I was homeschooled in the 90s in the Dallas area, but not in maybe the kind of classical, the more classical ended side of things that I think is more popular in homeschooling now. It really was more like, think 90s, kind of culture war Eva homeschooling. That was my intellectual pedigree. So, as part of that, I suppose I've experienced a lot of the same questions and tensions that you see arise in whatever you might call the ex-evangelical movement or something like that, right? You grow up, you hear all the claims, and you start to wonder, is this true? You go to college, you engage the sources, and then you start to see the teams that form. Do you pick them? That sort of thing. And I watched, I think, for a long time, a lot of my friends who were raised in a kind of let's prepare you to have the right worldview context lose their faith. So I think that was a deep formative part of my journey, was watching some friends lose their faith, and also never, on the one hand, just wondering, is a lot of the stuff that's around here true? Without wanting to, I suppose, really take, it never felt like an ex-evangelical narrative to me, in the sense that it didn't have that kind of maybe there was the risk of deconstruction. But I don't feel like my story was ever internally kind of implicitly going to end in kind of deconstruction. And so really what I've done for the last 20 years is turn that into a project, which is, hey, let me just sit here and try and think through the faith and the moral questions and the intellectual questions, the cultural questions, the theological questions, and feel the full pressure of those things, and as honestly as I can, and then see if scripture and natural revelation really do stand up to their weight and really have something profound to say to us to us about them and about reality. And I suppose then that's kind of the project, is maybe the same space that is psychologically occupied by kind of the evangelical narrative, but in the service of, hey, let's actually say orthodoxy and orthopraxy are solid foundations and can be talked about by honest humans in a non-ideological way, in a way that's ahead of us. In other words, maybe now I look at orthodoxy and orthopraxy as something I'm arriving into, something that's smarter than me and that I'm growing up into, rather than a fate of, something already here that I then just use in public. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we're all growing in and further up into that.
That's right.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit more about your kind of unique approach to these issues. I think a lot of people would share the same concern, but maybe go about it in, you, as you mentioned, kind of a worldview, culture warrior sort of way. And it sounds like you're wanting to do something a little bit different than that. So kind of help us catch your vision a little bit for how you want to speak to some of these very important issues.
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say there is like, the worldview critique can be overstated, right? And it's like a lot of the material produced in that context is good and it's helped others, it's helped me. I do think there can, and I'll just underline it that way, I do think there can be a tendency to treat our disorientations and our problems as though they're predominantly a matter of shifting ideas, and therefore orientation in this world is predominantly a matter of getting your ideas corrected and getting other people's ideas corrected. And there's a couple of problems with that. Actually, I could say a ton. Some of it is simply that we probably don't understand the very ideas we hold as much as we think we do. We're probably more inculcated into a tradition and a set of rhetorical practices more than we are actually coherently possessing a system, even though there's the kind of sensation that we're coherently possessing a system. And I think also it's just that persuasion in contact with reality works through the whole person. And I don't think we're very good at capturing the way in which the whole we're not trained very well to capture the way in which the whole person is involved in the engagement, the apologetic engagement, the engagement with the questions of the faith, and then therefore how to calibrate what we're communicating to the whole person, and not just as a strategic instrumentalizing practice, but actually, I suppose maybe one of the things that's, I don't want to call it unique in the approach, I think there's probably just a historic way of thinking about it. Actually, if you can do that for yourself, that actually puts you in the position, I think, to do it best for others. So Lewis can say things like, why can I write all these insights, right? Well, it's because I know me. I know what it's like to be a human, and I know what it's like to have a human heart, and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, I'd say like the approach is not terribly dissimilar to the kind of rhetoric, the kind of style, intellectual style, I think you'd get in a Lewis, the way he appeals, the way he has the whole person in view, the way he uses persuasion to appeal to both the mind and the affect in order to kind of pull the whole person by a whole truth, if I could put it that way. So there's something like that, nevertheless, with maybe you could say that a lot of what I'm doing in writing is kind of taking that rhetorical approach and then trying to stare at modern problems and say, like, C.S. Lewis isn't writing directly about, a lot of the things we're facing because he lived then and we live now. And so a lot of it is, but nevertheless, hey, let's get inside of our own civilization and take this approach to understanding ourselves, and then be able to bring reality, the concrete reality of our Orthodox faith and the practices that come with it, to bear in that context distinctively. And the last thing I'll say there is that I think if I could summarize that, it really is an alternative, trying to imagine an alternative to an ideological relationship to the faith. I think that's it, to feel like I possess the faith because I possess this set of ideas, and that's actually the solution to all the problems around me. That there's an enormous amount of problems with that. There's an enormous amount of ways in which that trains us to relate to people and ourselves wrongly, actually. And I think a lot of what I feel the burden of is to say, hey, let's get outside of that way of imagining what it even is. But that doesn't mean we're getting rid of orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Let's kind of resituate ourselves relative to them and really work through our doubts, work through our questions, precisely, in fact, in order to really and truly become fixedly and more confidently and calmly persuaded.
Yeah, this seems like really a more human, a more whole person approach, and not just a head approach.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Which Lewis would very much approve of.
Yes.
You know, in the abolition of man, that's something that he really focuses on.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely. A fascinating, right? Yeah, that in the abolition of man, my dear friend has pointed this out to me frequently, that when he begins to talk about disorientation from natural law, he doesn't begin with, look at this insane moral conclusion that somebody came up with, or this insane thought somebody had. He says, look at this person who doesn't know that you're allowed to just call a waterfall sublime. And that's interesting. You know, what the piece of man that he starts with is actually that weirdly, you can call it almost aesthetic or something like that, that visceral relation to the world that just says, wow, you know, that's where he starts. And I think that, yeah, that's insightful into his whole project in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit more about what you identify as some of the, well, maybe they're unique or maybe they're just very pointed problems that we're facing today. Problems that you specifically teach about, try to tackle, try to help your students and your readers engage with in this kind of whole person way.
Yeah, if I could answer that in one way, I think I'd just say that we live in the modern world and that is its own kind of trial and crisis. And I mean that in a technical sense, you know, crisis meaning just a moment of massive shift and reorientation, that sort of thing. It's a historical crisis in that sense. Most of what I am doing in my classes, and I think we'll get in a minute to the classes I teach, is really trying to bring this traditional material, whether it be philosophical or theological, but put it in conversation with us who are living here. And so in my classes, I never want to lose the angle, I suppose, at least among the faculty, maybe this is where I would have seen as kind of most my shtick, I suppose, is I never want to lose the angle of we're living right here in this room right now in 2023 is what it actually feels like to be a human and consider these things. And let's talk about what all that is while we are talking about orthodoxy and orthopraxy, so we don't become blind to ourselves and blind to what's going on with us as we're moving through all these things. And so to kind of tie a bow on that, if I could define that condition that I think we share and that I think is a challenge, modernity is not something I see as a bad thing. I'm never teaching it as like even if it's a crisis and a trial, that doesn't mean it's not intended by God and God doesn't have fruits to bring out of it. But I'm typically working with a definition that is modernity is the simultaneous global renegotiation of all human custom. So, you know, Taylor in A Secular Age can talk about how what it's like to believe changes when your belief, your deepest held beliefs are one option among many in the religious sphere. It's felt to be that way. And effectively what I'm doing in a lot of my classes is saying that's true of a bunch of other things too. It's different to perform masculinity and femininity. It's different to be an American or a Texan, or I'm now a Landrum, South Carolinian, in 2023 than it would have been in all of those other contexts, because custom, the fixedness of custom, which mediates kind of natural human flow and communication and all those things and understanding, that is all up for grabs rapidly with modern mobility and communications technology. You can talk about all the kind of architecture of that. But once that's the case, once you really are in the simultaneous global renegotiation of all human custom, I think actually we're all probably a little bit confused. And so what I think winds up happening is that apologetic schools and books on this, that, and the other and defending the faith become a kind of collection of therapies in a sense they become a sort of like we don't tell ourselves this. Maybe the claim that you're able to tell yourself is actually, I'm very confident and together. But I think a lot of these texts function as sorts of therapies to a, if I can put it this way, a kind of monkey brain that doesn't, that actually must find it very hard to really see this sea of options and feel that relativized. And I think we can just say out loud, don't we all feel a little bit that way? And then start there. And maybe you don't, and that's fine. But it's also okay to, and then move out from there and work with exactly where we're at. So I suppose that's, anytime I'm talking philosophy, theology, I never want to lose that angle and the way in which actually this material can still minister to us even here.
Right. And, I can imagine a lot of your students might, or your readers might feel something, and they can't even put the finger on what it is other than that they're deeply unmoored. And so you're even being able to kind of put a name to what they're feeling, and then why it is that they're feeling that way, and then how to move through that. So that's a great ministry to the head and the heart.
Mm.
Well, tell us more about your classes, and particularly the ones you'll be teaching in the next 12 months.
Yeah, so I think at this point, I could be misremembering the slate here. I have a fairly good routine of 4 courses that I sort of cycle through. I think the one coming up is actually the most relevant to what we've been discussing just now, is Approaches to Defending the Faith. In Approaches to Defending the Faith, I basically try to take some texts that most of us haven't read, Luigi Giussani, some others, Norris Clark, and work through what I find to be like really good ways to even talk about what does it mean that man has a religious orientation toward God? How do you appeal to that? What is the how do we actually speak about God philosophically? So I'm kind of working through basics of the faith, but then we end with reading 3 weeks of that 10-week course is just reading Miracles by C.S. Lewis. And so what you're doing there is kind of like, here now we're sitting and in the kind of the lessons of the master, and we're watching how he defends the faith. So it's not just what's the argument of the book. It's look at all these little things Lewis is doing to his audience and to his readers. And so there's an element of both, I want to give in that class a deep sense of like how to approach defending the faith, both as a whole project, as a whole person, the faith as a whole person, how to approach persuasion in a way that fixes something in you, but then how to turn that into rhetoric that you can then communicate to others in a way that appeals to their whole person. And so, that's the class coming up. After that, I think it's Philosophy for Theology. So we have a lot of, just as you know, Nathan, we have Ryan Hurd and Michael Lynch, and we have these great professors whose knowledge of the kind of theological vernacular of the tradition and the philosophical density in it is really, really fine-grained and detailed. And I suppose that Philosophy for Theology, I play the role of kind of wetting the whistle for all of that. A Philosophy for Theology is that 100,000 foot up perspective class where you read a little bit of metaphysics, a little bit of epistemology, a little bit of philosophical anthropology, a little bit of ethics, and you're trying to see how do all the big pieces, metaphysics, epistemology, human, the study of the human, that sort of thing, how do all of those pieces really fit together? And so in a sense, what you're trying to do is it's not really just then the communication of information, of course, but then also communicating a kind of style of mind. And so what you're also doing in a class like that is kind of just throwing categories at people so that it's like, oh, think of it this way, look at it that way. And so your mind begins to get a little more elastic so that when you go into those other courses, you've started with the smaller weights, you might say, before you go off to the advanced herd. Beyond that, let's see here. I teach Philosophy as a Way of Life. That's a kind of continuity of philosophy for theology. Philosophy as a Way of Life is much more looking at philosophy not as merely a set of content, but as a style of practice. That the philosophical gaze, the philosophical style of being is just that. It's a style of being. it's a way of being oriented to the world, and that is not just then motivated by content, but requires certain kinds of practical engagements. And I go through some of those practical engagements, but I'm also looking at the way philosophy as a way of life, that whole sense of philosophy, has been conceived of throughout time. And so there's both kind of a practical, but also a chronological dimension to the class. How did the Stoics and the Epicureans imagine philosophy as a whole project? But what's fun about doing that is then you can spend a whole week. We spend in that class a whole week on Jesus and Paul. Jesus now thought of within the history of philosophy. Paul now thought of within the history of philosophy, not just as staters of facts, but as whole ways of capturing reality in a life lived, and that sort of thing. So that's the one course. And then finally, I think I'll be doing this maybe it's every summer. I'm doing it right now. I'm in the middle of it. I teach a philosophy of modernity course, and that's really where I develop this claim I just made. Modernity is the simultaneous global renegotiation of all human custom. In that class, what we're doing is just working through some classic writers of the modern period, interpreters and theorists of modernity, to say, hey, what is this thing? How does technology, politics, the internet, secularism, find all the things? How do all those pieces, you spend a week kind of on each of those pieces and try to feel in a sense how they all fit together to create this singular condition.
Well, these are classes people certainly don't want to miss.
Yes. Well, I shouldn't advertise for myself. You can say that.
I can say that, guys.
Yeah, that's right.
Sign up for these classes.
Okay.
You don't want to miss
Thank you,
this.
brother.
Well, do you have any publications, either recently published or upcoming, that we can be looking out for?
Yeah. So the book I just published is a slightly more readable reworking of my dissertation. So Bulwarks of Unbelief, Atheism and Divine Absence in a Secular Age, I think is the subtitle they came up with at Lexham, just published by Lexham this just a couple months ago. And so, yeah, you can find that. That's probably my most robust academic thing out there right now. I'm in the process of writing I think what'll be the last book I write for a while, which is really a lot of what we talked about just now. It's an attempt to work through the basic claims of orthodoxy and orthopraxy, but from the perspective of a late modern person who's not naturally oriented to them, where they still feel a little weird. And how do you honestly say at the get-go, oh, virgin births and stuff, that's weird. Second comings, does that work? Not that not that that's an argument, right? But it's like the piece of me that feels like it's so foreign. How do I work with that relative to the faith? And so that's kind of what the book is working through, really, really, really coming to be persuaded of these things and to see how they really do fit into reality.
Well, we'll be on the lookout for that. And I'll just give the plug for Bulwarks of Unbelief. People should purchase it and read it. So as we kind of close out here, I wondered if you could kind of just help people understand why they should consider taking classes at Davenant Hall, and maybe even consider entering one of our degree programs.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of what Davenant Hall offers, beyond just, there's some obvious answers, right? There's affordability. There's access, and I don't mean me here, there's access to really great professors that would not have been teaching at an online program 10 or 15 years ago. And so it might be that, one thing's online theological education, and that has kind of associations, and that it can be fitting and fair. It's surprising to me just how robust of a program is virtual here. There is also, though, a residential component. So those who take the classes come up 2 times for a residential course here, and then even for a discipleship week. And so for a virtual program, there's a full 4 to 6 weeks of incarnate life that's necessary, and then supplemented by other networking and connections that you have. So there's all those sorts of practical things I could say. I think in addition to what I'd say there is, I think Davenant is offering a tutorship for self-educators through the theological, historical, philosophical, and ethical and biblical tradition. You really are getting all of that in one program, which is kind of exactly what, or in literature even, what a lot of people who are interested in the humanities want. And so they go off to college and spend thousands and thousands of dollars to kind of go through courses that they kind of want to take. Whereas at Davenant, it's like, look, if you're not trying to go get a degree to go become a professor, but you want tutorship through the tradition, it's affordable, it's accessible, it's exactly what you want, and I think it's better than what you're going to find elsewhere. There's all of that, but even all of that I don't think is the real good stuff at Davenant. I think that's the window dressing. I think the real good stuff at Davenant that makes it somewhat unique is that we're lay. Lewis could write about himself as a layman of the Church of England, but there was something about Lewis as a layman that was particularly fitted to communicate to his context. And so I think there are some advantages. Now, there can be some risks as well, but there's advantages to the fact that we're not strictly a seminary. We're not really a confessional school. We are a confessional school in the sense that there's we all subscribe in good faith to one of the kind of pan-Protestant basic magisterial confessions, right? But we're not a confessional school in the sense that we don't have a whole lot of kind of within big tent Protestantism, a whole lot of shibboleths that you can't just come and talk about. And even outside of that, if you're a Roman Catholic or an atheist, actually, and on this torch, not that those are equivalent, brother. But if you're one of those things, you also can kind of come, and I don't think the vibe at Davenant is one where the goal is, I'm nervous until you have landed where I need you to land. It really is rather, this is the place to be a free human soul who's curious. And really my only goal is to get you to work through those things as a free human soul and to possess them and internalize them through your own agency and intellectual and spiritual dominion, not through kind of a pressure that you must land somewhere. And so there's a lot of, I think, what people experience when they come to Davenant is an enormous amount of not just intellectual camaraderie, but an intellectual breath of fresh air, because they've not really been, it's kind of shocking to think, maybe we haven't been very often in contexts where where the conversation really is open and curious, and you can go places, and there's not that kind of ideological nervousness to make sure we land right over here really fast, even though, again, the teachers are solid, they're grounded, and I think they're nevertheless interested in students who are deeply persuaded of orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And so you do get there, you do land, but it's through discourse, it's through dialectic, and so it's a school of Athens in the digital age. I suppose that's what we should, our little nodal point in the modern Republic of Letters. I really think that's it. So, and the evidence for that is I've had students from 6 continents so far. We're 3 years in. I've had students from 6 continents. I haven't found my Antarctican yet, but we have students from 6 continents. I've had students from 6 continents. An enormous amount of a fascinating mix of men and women. Really, really fascinating to me. Partially, I think, because, in a lot of conservative seminaries, most of the people, I went to a RTS, loved it, very supportive of such institutions and what they do. Nevertheless, most people there are there to pursue an MDiv and go into the ministry. And so, like, if you're a woman, you can go there and learn a lot. But sometimes I wonder if there's you're sort of like, especially in all male clergy circles, there's kind of the fit. It can fit, but it can also be a little kind of two teamed. One thing that I think that's been really interesting at Davenant is that there are pastors and elders who take this for supplementary theological education, even seminary students whose seminaries let them use our courses for credit and that sort of thing. But the range of motivations for accessing what we do is very wide. And so you feel a kind of wide vantage point of the human race, both kind of geographically, but across the genders, even across the professions, kind of blue collar and not blue collar folks. And so that has been, I think, just really, really fascinating and really rewarding. And I think there's something special going on there.
Special is a good word for it. Well, if you want to learn more about Davenant Hall or register for any of our courses, you can go to davenanthall.com. Specifically, would encourage you to look into Joe Minich's courses. Approaches to Defending the Faith will be in the fall, Philosophy for Theology in the winter, Philosophy as a Way of Life in the spring, and the Philosophy of Modernity in the summer. Dr. Joe Minich, thank you so much for joining Davenant Hall Faculty Spotlight.
Thank you, brother.